Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This episode's going to have something of an unusual structure, but let's start by reading this note. The spider hides all rituals. They are not to be revealed. The enlightened truth need not be understood by anyone. Alright, that note's important, and we'll come back to it, but we've got a lengthy boss fight coming up, and I'd actually like to focus more on this next one first. When the red moon approaches, human boundaries become unclear. The great higher rank one appears, and will surely embrace us children. There's quite a lot going on in this note, including some extremely vague and ambiguous language, but as I'm sure you've noticed, there's a pretty big discrepancy between the final portion of the official English and the Japanese as I've translated it. Well, frustratingly, while some of that comes down to the ambiguity in the original wording that I just noted, there's also some linguistic evidence to suggest that, like we've seen a few times before, this is another case where the Japanese text was changed and the other languages were never updated to match. So, what's this linguistic evidence I mentioned? Well, it comes from the way this same note was translated into Korean, but to understand the nature of this evidence and why the Korean translation is so informative, we first need to get into some of the more pragmatic details of video game translation. Now, ideally, translation is a one-way process that goes directly from the source language, Japanese in this case, to the target language, say English. Also, for the most natural-sounding results, the translator should be translating into their native language. Where you start to run into issues, though, is that not all languages are equally popular. Lots of people speak English, so translating work into English will significantly broaden its reach. What's more, there are a lot more people that can translate from English into their native tongue than there are who can translate from Japanese into their native tongue. This simple set of facts, combined no doubt with a number of other complicating factors, means that often when translating a game from Japanese into other languages, the English language version is either used as a reference or is treated as the original text. Given the widespread popularity of Japanese entertainment products, my understanding is that things are shifting away from this, but in the case of Bloodborne, we don't really have to wonder about the translation process. Frog Nation, the company that produced the game's translation, posted a statement on their website regarding the process on June 12, 2015. Here they state that they started with director Hidetaka Miyazaki's Japanese language draft of the dialogue, created an English language script, oversaw the recording of the English language lines, then translated the in-game text from Japanese to English, and finally supervised the translation from the English into other Western languages. Now, we shouldn't forget that even in the Japanese version of Bloodborne, the default settings feature English language dialogue, so there are some unique circumstances at work here that arguably privilege the English text. But for the point that I'm trying to make here, what I want to focus on is that all of the versions of Bloodborne that feature Western languages were based on the English translation. That's because one way we might be able to determine whether the Japanese text got any updates that the other languages did not would be to compare those various translations to one another. If we have two translations from the Japanese that match one another but not the Japanese, that's a good indication that rather than a misunderstanding or localization choice on the part of the translators, we're looking at an instance of changed Japanese text. But in order for this method to work, we need those two translations to both come from the Japanese. If a translation that was based on the English matches up reasonably well with the English, that's only to be expected. This is what brings us back to the Korean, because as we saw above, it looks like it was only the Western languages that were based off of the English text. So if the Korean text for this note mentions something similar to a womb being blessed with child, there's reason to believe that both the English and the Korean text were based off of Japanese text that was subsequently changed. Now, I don't understand Korean in any capacity, but Last Protagonist, who has his own set of literal translations for Bloodborne, has provided his own English translation for the Korean version of this note, and it does seem to line up pretty well with the official English. And as we dive into Lakeland, let me just say that I think this is some very cool linguistic detective work on his part. Taken together with all of the other evidence we've seen that the Japanese text was updated in ways the English was not, I'm inclined to think this is a reasonable explanation for part of this discrepancy. The other part, of course, comes back to the ambiguous wording being used here, and I want to look at it in some detail because I think it helps demonstrate how there's often no safe option in translation. So let's start with a familiar question. How many Great Ones are supposed to appear when the red moon approaches? It's unclear. As we've seen before, it's not always specified in Japanese whether a noun is in the singular or the plural, and that's what we're seeing here. Remember, this is of potentially great importance to the game's lore, but the nature of the English language doesn't allow the translators to play it safe. There needs to be either a single great one or multiple great ones for the grammar of the English sentence to work, while the Japanese can afford to remain vague. So, without some further guidance, just looking at the text of this note, that means essentially guessing as to whether the singular or the plural makes more sense. While we're on the subject of singular versus plural, though, let's look at the next sentence, because here we do see one such indication of plurality being used. The normally singular ware, or I, has been modified into the form warera, meaning this is a form of the first person plural, like we or us. However, this is actually kind of unhelpful because it's not clear who is being included in this plural. Is this a reference to all of we humans in contrast to the great ones? Is it a reference to a select group of people? Is it a reference to humans and either a single great one or multiple great ones together? It's hard to say. My own intuitive take is that this is a reference to us children, speaking of humans generally and tying into the next word in the sentence. But this could easily be an instance where the subject marker has been dropped and warera is meant to be understood as we, making this sentence, and we will surely embrace children. It's also possible a possessive marker is being dropped after warera, and this would be, and surely embrace our children. Then again, in this formulation, it's unclear whether one child or multiple children are being referred to, which takes us back to the issue that started all this. But there's more going on here than just confusion over singular versus plural and the difficulty of identifying a subject. Not even the final verb is clear. It could be either dakan or idakan. The kanji could be read either way, and the line is never spoken to clarify which is accurate. Fortunately, as I mentioned back in Translationborne episode 41, these two verbs are pretty similar in meaning, but they could be used in more than one sense. So far I've gone with embrace, but what if we used another common meaning for the word, a reference to sleeping with someone? This line could be, and surely sleep with us children. Sounds like an eldritch liaison to me. Finally, I'll point out that I've been consistently interpreting this verb to be in the archaic mu form that I discussed back when we entered the Grand Cathedral, but it's also possible that this is simply the modern negative form. In other words, the final line could be anything from, and will not embrace us children, to, and we will not sleep with children. Now, some of these interpretations are more likely than others, but in the face of all this ambiguity, and with so little context to clarify things, it's really hard to come up with a single definitive version of this line. There is no safe interpretation. And this might be something to ask the development team about, but if the linguistic evidence is to be believed, perhaps the official interpretation shifted over time. Or maybe that's not what happened. It's hard to know what went on during the translation process. But even if both sets of translators saw this, interpreted the Japanese line as, and we will surely carry a child, and made the leap from there to, a womb will be blessed with child, I still think it's important to bear in mind just how vague this line is, because I think it shows how sometimes, in situations like this, all you can do is make the choices you believe in and hope it comes out alright. So having said all that, let's now turn back to the first note we looked at in this episode, where there's one specific word choice I'd like to focus on. In the original Japanese, the second line makes reference to keimo teki shinjitsu. Here, shinjitsu, which means truth, is being modified by keimo teki, which is an adjectival form of the noun keimo, or enlightenment. This is why my more literal version has this as the enlightened truth. But you might remember the term keimo from way back in episode 2 of Translationborne, because this is the same word that the Japanese uses for the game term that's been translated as insight. In other words, it's possible that it might make more sense to think of keimo teki shinjitsu as the insightful truth, as opposed to the enlightened truth, which may tie in with some of the mechanics of the game that reveal certain truths about the state of the world if the player character has enough insight. Now, with that being said, I think it's also worth noting that the official English doesn't use any adjectives to modify truth, but instead refers to true enlightenment, because this is something that also comes up in a literal translation that Last Protagonist has made from the Korean, meaning it's possible this is another instance of a change to the Japanese text not reflected in the other languages. Whether or not that's the case, though, I did want to point out this other way to understand the Japanese as it's currently used in the game. And having done that, let's turn at long last to the translation of this boss name. This one's interesting to me for a few reasons. First, there's the descriptor, which I think is a great example of how the translation team was able to skillfully preserve meaning while also maintaining an appropriate tone. You see, literally the Japanese term being employed here shares a lot of similarities with the word idiot in English, both in the sense of potentially being a literary reference and in its historical use as a derogatory term. However, I don't think that Rom the Idiot Spider results in a very good boss name. It strikes me as anticlimactic and even a little bit silly, in a way that runs counter to the intended atmosphere of this moment. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. You want to use language of an appropriate tone to preserve the feeling of the moment. This boss name needs to be insulting, convey the idea that the boss it's describing essentially has a mind that's blank, but still sound appropriate to a major battle that's going to culminate in a huge change to the world. The official translation of vacuous, at least in my mind, manages to achieve all three. And at the risk of getting a little ahead of things, I think this point comes through even clearer when you keep in mind that this boss and its key descriptor are going to get referred to later in dialogue. Just hearing the phrase, "as once you did for the idiot Rom," sounds a lot less impactful to me than, "as once you did for the vacuous Rom." And actually, this is a line I think it's worth remembering as we turn to the name Rom itself. You may have noticed that my more literal version featured an A at the end, making this Roma instead of Rom. And while there are a number of reasons I think it's interesting that this final letter was dropped, possibly the most salient of these involves outside associations that likely aren't as much of an issue in Japanese. The English spelling of Roma brings up a long list of potential references, from the city of Rome to the Roma or Romani people, which is where I'd like to go back to that previous line, "as once you did for the vacuous Rom." Consider the implications of having the name of a group of people put in place of the fantasy boss name Rom here. As we've seen before, sometimes shifting cultural contexts can require changes to a game script. But is that a baby I hear crying? Definitely a baby, and a red moon before the disorienting darkness. Hold on, I think these will be relevant to the next textual comparison. The concealment of the ritual was broken. Search for the baby of the nightmare. Okay, these notes have a tendency to be kind of vague and cryptic, so let's review some of what we've learned in the game so far, briefly examining relevant portions of the translation as we go. And I'd like to start by paying particular attention to the concealment or secret mentioned in the first part of this message. Perhaps our first vague hint comes from a note we found when we first entered the cathedral ward, explaining that the Byrgenwerth spider hides all manner of rituals. Then there's another strange note we found after being kidnapped and taken to Yahar'gul that talks about madmen whose ritual will summon the moon, noting that it is being hidden and concluding that its concealment must be broken. This is the point where what I've literally been translating as concealment becomes most relevant, because the Japanese phrasing being used here, hitoku o yaburu, is exactly the same that recurs in the on-screen note we just saw, hitoku wa yabureta. Or in the official English, we've gone from uncover their secrets in the Yahar'gul note to ritual secret broken in the on-screen message. The parallel isn't quite as strong in the English, but the idea is that we've done what the Yahar'gul note was saying by breaking the concealment of the ritual to summon the moon. We're not quite done yet though, because we still have the two notes we just looked at in Byrgenwerth. The first of these reiterates that the spider is hiding all manner of rituals before literally concluding that the enlightened or insightful truth need not be understood. The second tells us of what happened when the red moon hangs low, mentioning the appearance of a great one, or great ones, and something to do with a baby. Again, the Japanese is pretty vague here, but speaking of babies, not only did we hear one crying in the last cutscene, but we also just got an on-screen message about seeking a nightmare newborn. Though, as you may have come to expect by now, the Japanese is ambiguous and could be interpreted in two potential ways. It could be referring to a nightmare newborn in the sense of a nightmarish child, or it might be referring to a nightmare newborn in the sense of a baby of or in a nightmare. Due to later events in the game, I've gone with the latter option for my more literal version, but I actually think this is a case where the official translation is functionally ambiguous enough to encompass both meanings of the Japanese. This, as we've seen, is not often an option, so I thought it was worth pointing out. But let's return now to our summary. Basically, it seems like there was a ritual meant to summon the red moon that was being performed. Rom was somehow concealing this such that only an enlightened or insightful few could perceive what was going on. Defeating her broke that concealment, and now our task has shifted. We've been told to find a mysterious nightmare newborn, and we even have a bit more to go on than that thanks to one last note that we found in Yahar'gul, a place which we just so happened to have re-entered from a new direction. Anyway, the note made reference to a nightmare ritual of some kind being together with a baby. Then we were told to find either a baby or the baby and stop that crying voice. I realize this summary in some ways is vagueness on top of ambiguity, but I wanted to show how in some sense things are starting to come together to give us a new goal. We need to find the nightmare baby and stop its cries so the strange ritual we exposed will come to an end. This will hopefully bring about the end of the hunt as well, since we've also seen some indication that the proximity of the red moon blurs the boundaries of humanity and may be the source of the current beastly scourge. However, that task is going to have to wait for a while. As I mentioned in my previous episode, I'll be taking a break from this Translationborne series for some time as I focus on making more progress through the Chalice dungeons. If you're interested in seeing that process, you're welcome to join me for my Chalice Chat series instead. Or, on the other hand, if you prefer some videos that focus more on the lore implications of the Japanese version of Bloodborne, you may want to check out Last Protagonist's Fear the Old Lore series if you haven't already done so. This episode would have been very different without his work looking at the Korean version of the game, and as I mentioned before, he has his own translations for pretty much everything in Bloodborne, along with some highly developed ideas about the lore. Whether you check out either of those series, though, I would encourage you, as always, to share any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have for me. Until next time, then, thanks for watching, everyone.